Hey guys, tonight we're going to delve into the world of Emperor Menelik II of Ethiopia. A ruler whose reign, though often considered uneventful, was filled with subtle twists and turns that shaped his nation in ways we're still unraveling today. You might think you've heard all about his military victories or his diplomatic moves. But you probably won't survive this. The seemingly quiet moments often contain the most intriguing secrets. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to hear where you're watching from, so drop your location and local time in the comments below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Menelik II of Ethiopia, his name rings out in African history. Mostly due to one incredible victory, the Battle of Adwa. But beyond that, his reign can seem like an endless stretch of calm, unremarkable days. On the surface, Ethiopia thrived under his rule, yet historians still argue about how much of this was truly Menelik's doing. Was he a visionary who kept his country out of colonial hands? Or did fate simply smile on him? Born in 1844 as the son of King Haile Melekot, Menelik's early years were marked by more exile than palace life. He spent much of his youth in a place far from the throne, under the rule of the regional king of Shewa. But this early separation from the center of power didn't isolate Menelik from the intricacies of governance, far from it. His exile served as a training ground, teaching him the ropes of leadership, survival, and the delicate art of playing political games. The young prince, with his sharp instincts, soon realized that power was both a fleeting and dangerous thing. His upbringing in the court of Shewa, far from the capital, offered him a unique vantage point of Ethiopian politics. He observed, he learned, and most importantly, he waited. Was it this long wait, this careful cultivation of alliances, that made him so well positioned to claim the throne when the time came? Here's the thing. Menelik didn't seize power with the drama of a battlefield coup or a fiery public speech. His path to the throne wasn't as flashy as one might expect from a historical figure of his stature. In 1865, when Emperor Tewodros II died in battle, Menelik's chance arrived. Rather than fighting for the throne, he simply took advantage of the chaos that followed the emperor's death. The political vacuum created by his predecessor's demise allowed Menelik to ascend without bloodshed. Yet many historians debate whether he genuinely wanted the crown or simply stepped in because the opportunity presented itself. Was it a bold move or a calculated inevitability? Over the next few years, Menelik would manage to consolidate his power. But his reign wasn't just about smooth transitions or diplomatic poise. His rise to the throne was marked by personal ambition, but also by an ever-present sense of caution. This cautious approach would define much of his reign, a steady hand that quietly guided Ethiopia through one of the most turbulent periods in its history. It's easy to forget that there was once a time when Menelik's calm was seen as a strength, while other rulers lost their heads in the midst of political storms. Menelik remained unflustered, methodical even, and that calm would come to characterize the reign that followed. Historians still argue whether Menelik's initial silence was a deliberate strategy or simply a reflection of the uncertainty he felt in those early years. But one thing is for certain: his rise wasn't marked by the kind of chaotic power grabs we often associate with great leaders. Rather, Menelik's first years as emperor were quiet, methodical, and marked by the steady pursuit of stability. By now, you may be wondering, how much of this calm was actually his doing? Or did the events around him simply fall into place like a well-arranged game of dominoes? This ambiguity will follow us throughout his entire reign. What's clear is that Menelik knew how to take advantage of the currents of history, using every advantage available to him. As we move deeper into Menelik's story, let's rewind a bit and explore his early years, which set the stage for the reign that followed. Imagine a young Menelik, raised not in the imperial palace but in the relatively peaceful and isolated province of Shewa. He wasn't born in the shadow of an emperor's throne, but instead, in the quiet of a region relatively far from the capital. His mother, Empress Tiruwerk, and his father, King Haile Melekot, weren't the reigning monarchs of Ethiopia, at least not in a way that would immediately draw attention. The political life of Menelik's early days was a world away from the drama of imperial courts. And yet it was here that he would learn many of the lessons that would eventually propel him to the throne. The exile years, far from being a disadvantage, actually set Menelik apart from many other royal figures of his time. The fact that he was not immediately in the thick of the most intense political struggles of the day gave him a unique kind of clarity and perspective. Instead of growing up steeped in the complex and often dangerous political games of the capital, Menelik was able to observe from a distance, learning the intricacies of power, survival, and loyalty. His position wasn't one of immediate threat or tension, but it did allow him to see the weaknesses of the throne. And perhaps more importantly, it allowed him to see the ways in which different factions were vying for control of Ethiopia. By the time Menelik became a young adult, he was more than just the son of a regional king. He had become a student of Ethiopian politics. Some say this gave him an advantage. His relative outsider status meant that Menelik had no particular ties to the powerful factions that were vying for control of the country, allowing him to position himself as a neutral party. He wasn't directly involved in the rivalry between the Ethiopian nobility and the various regions trying to stake their claim to the throne. Instead, he spent much of his time securing alliances and building his own power base in Shewa. Yet, even in the relative peace of Shewa, Menelik was not completely removed from the goings-on of the empire. He knew that while the center of power might have been in the capital, it was ultimately the regional leaders like himself who would decide the fate of Ethiopia. Menelik was already playing a long game, a game that few would have suspected him of in his younger years. His ability to manage the relationship between the central authority and the provinces would serve him well once he finally took the throne. One of the key factors that enabled Menelik to rise to power was the constant instability within the empire. Ethiopia, at this time, was not a unified country under a single emperor. Instead, it was a patchwork of semi-autonomous regions, each with its own rulers, constantly at odds with one another. Menelik's ability to navigate this fractured political landscape was nothing short of impressive. He learned early on how to balance loyalty and competition, how to make allies when necessary and enemies when expedient. This ability to shift between different political roles helped him later on when he was forced to step into the vacuum created by the death of Emperor Tewodros II in 1865. Historians still debate whether Menelik ever really had a grand ambition to become emperor or if his rise was simply the result of seizing an unexpected opportunity. Some claim he was always meant to be emperor, while others argue that Menelik merely stepped into a power void, using his intelligence and strategic alliances to claim the throne when it became available. Regardless of the initial intent, one thing is clear: Menelik was far from unprepared when the time came to claim the title of Emperor of Ethiopia. As Menelik's early life unfolded, the seeds of his later reign were being sown. His time in Shewa may have seemed like a quiet, uneventful period, but in reality, it was a crucial apprenticeship in the complex and often unpredictable world of Ethiopian politics. Menelik learned to use time to his advantage, avoiding rash decisions and instead waiting for the right moment to act. This cautious, deliberate approach would serve him well when he finally ascended to the throne. So, when Menelik finally did claim the imperial crown, it wasn't the dramatic moment one might expect. Instead, it was a calm and calculated move that reflected the steady hand of a man who had spent his early years learning the art of leadership, patience, and strategy. By the time Menelik II ascended the throne in 1889, the political landscape of Ethiopia had shifted significantly. His rise wasn't the result of an elaborate power struggle or an epic rebellion. It was more of a quiet slide into power, facilitated by the changing tides of the nation and his own careful maneuvering. Menelik's ascension didn't come with the fiery speech or dramatic battles that often accompany the rise of historical figures. Instead, it was the result of a long series of political moves, subtle alliances, and, perhaps most importantly, the death of his predecessor, Emperor Johannes IV. In 1889, Johannes's death left Ethiopia in a state of flux, no clear successor, no immediate plans for a smooth transition of power. You see, Ethiopia was a fragmented empire at the time, with various powerful regional leaders controlling different provinces. Menelik, as the ruler of Shewa, was one of the most significant of these regional powers. But there were others, including the monarchs of Tigray and Amhara. While the country was technically unified under the title of emperor, the authority of the crown was far from absolute. Menelik knew this all too well. He understood that Ethiopia was a country not of a single throne, but of many overlapping thrones. Each regional ruler had his own power base, and the emperor had to navigate this delicate balance. Menelik's path to the throne was neither violent nor particularly dramatic. It was a slow and strategic climb, aided by a combination of alliances, timing, and a bit of luck. It wasn't so much that Menelik wrested the throne from anyone, but rather that he was in the right place at the right time. After Johannes IV's death, the various factions within Ethiopia looked to Menelik as the most viable option for leading the empire forward. He had the support of Shewa, the largest and most powerful province, and he was a man who had built up decades of political experience and loyalty. So when the time came, Menelik stepped into the role of Emperor of Ethiopia with little resistance. Historians still argue whether Menelik's ascension was inevitable or if it was merely a case of political opportunism. Some claim that Menelik was destined for the throne, while others suggest that it was the result of a series of fortunate circumstances that allowed him to take the crown. Regardless of the specific circumstances, Menelik's rule began in a time of great uncertainty, both for Ethiopia and for the rest of the world. The scramble for Africa was in full swing, and European powers were eyeing Ethiopia, just as they had other parts of Africa, for colonization. But Menelik, perhaps more than any other ruler of the time, was able to balance the pressures from the outside world with the internal struggles that had long plagued Ethiopia. Menelik's early days as emperor were marked by efforts to consolidate power, not just over the various regions of Ethiopia but also over the many factions that controlled them. He was no stranger to the tensions that existed between the various tribes and peoples of the empire. But he also knew that a fragmented Ethiopia would never stand up to the growing colonial ambitions of European powers. His first few years in power were largely spent strengthening the internal cohesion of his empire, bringing the disparate regions under a more unified authority, and making sure his hold on power was solidified. But Menelik wasn't just focused on internal issues. He knew that Ethiopia would need to be able to defend itself against external threats if it was going to survive in a world increasingly dominated by European imperialism. This awareness of external threats played a major role in shaping Menelik's foreign policy. Historians still argue about Menelik's true intentions when it came to his dealings with foreign powers. Some claim that Menelik was always focused on keeping Ethiopia independent from European colonizers, while others suggest that his diplomatic relations with European countries were more about buying time and securing arms rather than outright defiance. What we can say with certainty is that Menelik understood the importance of diplomacy. Under his leadership, Ethiopia maintained a delicate balancing act, playing European powers against each other and managing to avoid the fate of neighboring countries that had fallen under colonial rule. He sought allies where he could find them, and he was always aware of the larger geopolitical landscape. One of Menelik's most significant achievements early in his reign was the Battle of Adwa in 1896. The battle, which saw Ethiopian forces defeat the Italian army, is often cited as one of the most important moments in African history. It was a victory not just for Ethiopia but for the entire African continent, demonstrating that colonial powers could be defeated. But even this victory wasn't as simple as it seems. Historians still debate the factors that led to Ethiopia's success. Was it purely military strategy? Or were there deeper, more complex factors at play? Did Menelik's military genius alone win the day? Or was it the result of superior knowledge of the terrain, better logistics, and the determination of the Ethiopian people? While Menelik's reign was not one filled with constant battles and dramatic events, his ability to maintain Ethiopia's sovereignty in a time of intense European colonial expansion was no small feat. His diplomatic and military strategies, particularly the Battle of Adwa, were key to keeping Ethiopia free from colonial rule. But these successes didn't necessarily make Menelik a hands-on emperor. His reign, for the most part, was characterized by a slow, almost unremarkable march toward internal consolidation and international survival. The Battle of Adwa in 1896, what a moment in history. For Ethiopia, it was nothing short of a triumph. But Menelik's victory wasn't just a military win, it was a political one. 2. The Battle of Adwa solidified Menelik's status as a leader who could not only navigate the internal complexities of his empire, but also fend off one of Europe's rising powers. The Italians, eager to expand their colonial holdings in Africa, had been encroaching on Ethiopia, believing they could easily conquer the country. But on the 1st of March 1896, the Ethiopian forces, led by Menelik, decisively defeated the Italian army. This victory was, and still is, celebrated across Ethiopia as a pivotal moment in the nation's history. However, historians still argue whether Menelik's victory was due more to his military genius or the sheer numbers and resilience of his forces. Could the Italians have won if the terrain had been different? Or did Menelik's understanding of Ethiopia's geography, along with the strategic decisions he made, give his army the advantage? Some claim that Menelik was a brilliant tactician, while others suggest that luck and local knowledge played as big a role as his leadership. But regardless of the debate, one thing is clear: Menelik's success in Adwa sent shockwaves across Africa and Europe. For African nations, it was a symbol of resistance and hope. For European powers, it was a wake-up call, a reminder that they couldn't simply steamroll over every African nation. The victory at Adwa marked a rare instance in which a colonized African nation stood its ground and triumphed over a European imperial power. But Menelik wasn't one to boast too much about this victory. In the years following Adwa, his rule took on a more subdued tone. After the Battle of Adwa, Menelik's reign seemed to settle into a period of relative peace. The nation, having secured its independence from European colonization, was left to focus on internal growth. Ethiopia, under Menelik's leadership, became a symbol of resistance against European imperialism. However, despite the monumental nature of the victory, Menelik's later years as emperor weren't filled with grand military victories. Instead, they were marked by a series of smaller, more subtle efforts to modernize Ethiopia and strengthen the nation's position in the world. Menelik's modernization efforts were focused on several key areas, including infrastructure, education, and diplomacy. While some historians view these efforts as progressive, others argue that Menelik's modernization plans weren't as grand as they might have seemed. For example, his efforts to build roads and railways were ambitious, but Ethiopia was still a largely agrarian society, and these projects were difficult to implement without external support. Some have even suggested that Menelik's modernization efforts were more about securing foreign aid than creating a truly modern nation. In truth, Menelik didn't completely reshape Ethiopia, rather, he introduced incremental changes that would become important over time. One area where Menelik's modernization plans were particularly noteworthy was in his efforts to strengthen the Ethiopian military. The threat of colonial invasion loomed large throughout Menelik's reign, and he knew that a well-equipped military would be crucial for the country's survival. In the years following the Battle of Adwa, Menelik worked to modernize the Ethiopian army, equipping it with more modern weapons and training its soldiers in new tactics. This wasn't an easy task, as Ethiopia lacked the resources and industrial capacity of European powers. But Menelik's determination to safeguard his nation was evident. Historians still debate the effectiveness of these efforts, as the Ethiopian military, despite being well prepared, was often hampered by logistical and financial challenges. At the same time, Menelik recognized the importance of diplomacy. In the years following Adwa, Ethiopia sought to establish diplomatic relations with European powers, particularly Italy, in order to avoid future conflicts. Menelik's diplomacy was, however, often a balancing act. He needed to keep European powers at bay while also ensuring that Ethiopia remained a respected member of the international community. Some historians argue that Menelik's diplomacy was more about buying time and ensuring that Ethiopia remained independent, rather than creating lasting alliances with European powers. Others suggest that Menelik was a master of diplomacy, skillfully navigating the complex world of international relations to Ethiopia's benefit. However, despite his efforts, Menelik's reign wasn't without its internal challenges. While the Battle of Adwa had secured Ethiopia's independence, it had also highlighted the underlying tensions within the empire. Ethiopia, under Menelik, was still a collection of diverse regions, each with its own customs, languages, and political systems. The challenge of unifying these various factions remained an ongoing issue throughout Menelik's reign. Some historians argue that Menelik's success in maintaining the unity of the empire was one of his greatest achievements, while others suggest that his rule didn't do enough to address the deep divisions within Ethiopian society. Menelik's internal governance was marked by a delicate balance between central authority and regional autonomy. He had to maintain control over the various regional leaders while also appeasing them with a certain degree of independence. This political balancing act wasn't always successful, and there were several instances of rebellion and unrest during his reign. These internal struggles were largely overshadowed by Menelik's more prominent achievements on the international stage, but they were a significant part of his reign. As Menelik continued his reign, the internal pressures would eventually begin to take their toll, but for now, Ethiopia remained united and independent, standing as a beacon of resistance in a world rapidly being divided by colonial powers. The years following Adwa may have been less dramatic than the battle itself, but they were still crucial in shaping Menelik's legacy as a ruler who managed to balance both the external and internal challenges of leading Ethiopia through one of the most turbulent times in its history. As Menelik II's reign moved forward, the challenges of maintaining both internal unity and external sovereignty began to show their true complexity. Menelik had managed to skillfully navigate the political landscape in the early years of his rule. But as time went on, it became evident that a delicate balance would need to be struck between the various ethnic groups and regional leaders that made up Ethiopia. The country, while free from European colonization after the Battle of Adwa, was still a patchwork of conflicting interests, loyalties, and ambitions. Menelik's task wasn't just to maintain power but to do so while keeping Ethiopia's disparate regions functioning as a cohesive whole. One of the major points of contention during Menelik's rule was the issue of land distribution. In Ethiopia's feudal system, the emperor controlled vast swathes of land, but much of the actual land management was in the hands of regional lords and noble families. These noble families, in turn, held significant influence over the peasants who worked the land. Menelik, in his attempts to modernize Ethiopia, understood that a change in land distribution could potentially reduce tensions and help create a more unified society. However, any efforts to redistribute land were met with fierce resistance from the local nobility, who saw such moves as a threat to their power. Historians still debate whether Menelik's land policies were meant to genuinely reform Ethiopian society or if they were simply designed to solidify his own power. Some argue that Menelik's reforms were mostly symbolic, small changes meant to placate the nobility and ensure their continued loyalty. Others suggest that his vision for land redistribution was more ambitious, aiming to create a more centralized and efficient state. But regardless of intent, Menelik's attempts at land reform were not particularly successful. The traditional power structures of Ethiopia were too entrenched, and any attempts to disturb them were met with resistance from powerful regional leaders. Another challenge Menelik faced was Ethiopia's educational system. While Ethiopia was relatively isolated from much of the Western world during Menelik's reign, the emperor knew that the modernization of his country would require an educated populace. In the late 19th century, Menelik began to open schools and encourage the development of an Ethiopian education system. These schools focused on both traditional Ethiopian knowledge and Western-style education, with an emphasis on the arts, science, and foreign languages. This was a forward-thinking move, and one that would benefit Ethiopia in the years to come. However, the education system remained limited, and the majority of Ethiopians still lived in rural areas with little access to formal schooling. Menelik's limited success in education could be partly attributed to the difficult terrain of Ethiopia itself. The country's vast and varied landscape made communication and transportation between regions a logistical nightmare. Roads were few and far between, and railroads were only just beginning to take shape under Menelik's leadership. While some infrastructure projects were completed, roads were built, and telegraph lines stretched across the empire, the sheer size and remoteness of Ethiopia's regions made large-scale educational reform difficult. Historians still argue about how much Menelik could have achieved in this area had he been able to devote more resources to education. But given the logistical challenges, his progress was slow. While Menelik's ambitions for modernization were clear, they were also limited by the reality of Ethiopia's socio-political structure. His reforms, though well-intentioned, were often thwarted by the powerful regional lords, who were reluctant to give up their traditional privileges. As a result, Menelik's vision of a modern Ethiopia, with centralized governance and a more equitable distribution of wealth, would remain only partially realized during his reign. But not all of Menelik's reign was consumed by struggles for internal unity. Despite the challenges, Ethiopia did experience some degree of economic and social progress under his rule. For example, the introduction of modern technologies, such as the telegraph and the railroad, did help improve communication and trade in some regions. Although the infrastructure wasn't yet on the level of European nations, it was a step toward creating a more connected and modern Ethiopia. Some historians view Menelik's attempts at infrastructure development as an early sign of his desire to bring Ethiopia into the modern world, even if those efforts were ultimately hampered by the sheer scale of the nation's problems. Furthermore, Menelik's reign was characterized by a series of diplomatic overtures to neighboring countries. While the battle against Italy had solidified his nation's place as a free African country, Menelik also sought to maintain good relations with European powers, particularly Britain and France, while keeping them at arm's length. Ethiopia, under Menelik's guidance, was in a somewhat precarious position. While it was an African success story, surrounded by European imperial powers, Menelik had to carefully navigate the diplomatic waters to keep Ethiopia's independence intact. Some historians argue that Menelik was a master of diplomacy, able to keep the European powers at bay by playing one against the other. His shrewd understanding of European rivalries allowed him to secure military and economic support when needed. However, there were moments during Menelik's reign when Ethiopia's fragile unity came close to breaking apart. The pressures of modernity, the demands of regional elites, and the external threats from European powers often put Menelik in a difficult position. It wasn't easy to keep the peace among his diverse subjects, and Menelik's ability to maintain order and stability in such a complex environment was, at times, more about damage control than proactive leadership. Though Menelik continued to push for internal reforms, his health would soon become a major factor in his leadership. By the late 1890s, Menelik's health had begun to deteriorate, leaving him less able to govern effectively. The emperor's growing health issues had a noticeable impact on his decision-making, and many historians argue that this contributed to his eventual decline in power. His illnesses also created a power vacuum at the top, one that would eventually lead to a crisis of succession in Ethiopia. For now, however, Ethiopia remained a symbol of resistance against European colonialism, its leader still holding the reins of a nation that had defied the odds. The kingdom, though struggling in many areas, was holding its own. Menelik's legacy, while mixed, had secured Ethiopia's independence for the time being, and that alone was an accomplishment worth remembering. As the early 1900s rolled in, Menelik I's health began to deteriorate rapidly. This was a significant turning point in his reign, and for the first time, the empire faced a leadership crisis. Menelik's declining health and eventual incapacitation brought Ethiopia's stability into question. His inability to govern left a power vacuum that would eventually lead to the rise of new figures. But Menelik's own struggle to maintain control during this period reflects the frailty of his rule in the later years. Historians still debate the extent to which Menelik was actually incapacitated. Some say that he was completely unable to govern by the end of his life, while others suggest that he continued to exert influence behind the scenes, even as his physical health worsened. At the heart of Menelik's decline was the fact that, while he had once been a unifying figure, the structure of his empire had begun to crack under the weight of its own complexities. The lack of a clear succession plan had left the Ethiopian monarchy vulnerable, and Menelik's inability to manage his own health made matters worse. His reign, once marked by stability and diplomatic finesse, began to show cracks as internal tensions resurfaced. As the emperor's condition worsened, factions within his court began to squabble over succession. The problem wasn't just that Menelik's heir was unclear, it was also that the different regions of Ethiopia had become more assertive in their demands for greater autonomy. While Menelik had been able to balance these regional rivalries during the height of his power, the vacuum left by his illness gave rise to new ambitions and internal struggles. At this point, Empress Taytu, Menelik's wife, played a key role in trying to manage the situation. Taytu was a politically astute woman who had been involved in many of the key decisions during Menelik's reign. But with Menelik incapacitated, Taytu had no clear authority, and her position within the power structure was precarious. As one of the most influential women in Ethiopian history, Taytu did what she could to protect the integrity of the empire. She was rumored to have attempted to assert control and even tried to resist the rise of a new power within the court. But her efforts were not always successful. Menelik's health problems were not only a personal issue, they were also a political one. As his condition worsened, the Ethiopian people began to worry about the future of their nation. Without strong leadership, they feared that Ethiopia would fall into disarray, unable to defend itself against the ever-growing pressure from European imperialists. During this time, the balance of power within the country began to shift, and the focus of both foreign and domestic observers shifted toward what would happen after Menelik's death. By 1911, Menelik I's condition had become so severe that he was no longer able to fulfill his duties as emperor. His successors would find themselves in a complicated situation. Menelik's power base, while still strong, was divided by the regional tensions and power struggles that had always been part of Ethiopian society. It wasn't just a matter of succession, it was about which faction would emerge victorious from the brewing conflict. It's important to note that Menelik's inability to resolve the succession question and his weakening health were among the primary reasons for the eventual decline of the stability he had worked so hard to create. His failure to secure a smooth transition of power left Ethiopia vulnerable to destabilizing forces. Historians have long debated Menelik's intentions during this period. Was he aware of the internal tensions that his illness had unleashed? Or was he simply too weak to manage them? Some argue that Menelik, aware of the situation, might have consciously sought to keep a degree of order in place, even if it was only symbolic. Others claim that Menelik, so consumed by his health issues, was effectively detached from the governance of the nation by the end of his reign. The reality is likely somewhere in between. The power struggle following Menelik's incapacity was neither quick nor clean. The infighting within the royal court and between regional leaders would set the stage for the challenges Ethiopia would face in the 20th century. In particular, the rise of Ras Bitwadad Tessema and other regional lords represented a return to the old system of decentralized power that Menelik had worked so hard to control. Menelik had been a master of balancing these forces, but with his inability to govern, they were free to assert themselves more aggressively. This left Ethiopia in a precarious position, caught between its traditional feudal past and the demands of the modern world. As Menelik's reign came to an end, it was clear that his leadership, while significant in preserving Ethiopia's independence, had not been enough to solve the deeper, more systemic issues within the empire. His efforts to modernize were laudable, but the failure to fully implement these reforms meant that the country was still far from being a cohesive, unified state. The regional tensions that had simmered throughout his reign would continue to shape Ethiopian politics for years to come. While Menelik is often remembered as a hero for his victory at Adwa and his efforts to keep Ethiopia free from European colonialism, the latter years of his reign tell a more complicated story. By the time of Menelik's death in 1913, Ethiopia stood at a crossroads. The empire was still intact, and it had retained its independence in the face of European colonial expansion. But the internal divisions within the country were undeniable. The transition of power after Menelik's death would set the stage for future political instability and conflict. Ethiopia would face new challenges in the coming decades, ones that would prove to be as complex as the ones Menelik had faced during his reign. Though Menelik I's final years were marked by internal strife, his legacy as a leader who kept Ethiopia free from colonial rule remained firmly intact. However, the way he left the throne, without resolving the question of succession, meant that his empire would face continued turbulence in the years after his passing. Menelik's inability to fully resolve Ethiopia's internal divisions would ultimately play a significant role in the struggles the country would face in the 20th century. Following Menelik I's death in 1913, Ethiopia found itself in a fragile political landscape. The passing of a ruler who had not only secured the country's independence but also held together its diverse factions left a significant gap in leadership. Without Menelik's ability to balance power between regional lords, the centralized authority he had worked hard to establish quickly unraveled. The absence of a clear succession plan only deepened the uncertainty. Menelik's son, Emperor Iyasu V, was next in line, but his youth and lack of experience meant that he was ill-prepared to navigate the complex power structures that Menelik had once managed so deftly. Historians still debate whether Iyasu was a viable successor or whether he was merely a puppet in the hands of more powerful figures. Iyasu was seen by some as a forward-thinking ruler, one who could potentially continue his father's modernization efforts. Others, however, viewed him as weak and indecisive, a ruler who was too reliant on his advisors. One of the key figures in Iyasu's court was Empress Tatu, Menelik's widow, who continued to hold considerable influence. But while Tatu had once been a powerful figure, she had not been able to maintain control over the shifting political tides of the time. Her efforts to retain power were often thwarted by other factions in the court, and her eventual fall from grace reflected the increasingly fragmented nature of Ethiopia's political system. Iyasu's reign was marked by confusion and instability. Despite his father's legacy of unity, Iyasu struggled to keep the various regional leaders in check. The regional lords, once loyal to Menelik, now began to assert their independence. Ethiopia's internal divisions became more pronounced, as regional leaders sought to expand their own power bases. This led to frequent uprisings and rebellions, as local leaders attempted to carve out their own territories within the empire. The central authority, once so strong under Menelik, was now reduced to little more than a figurehead. As a result, Ethiopia faced a new era of political fragmentation, one that would last well into the 20th century. In an attempt to strengthen his position, Iyasu sought support from foreign powers, particularly the Ottomans and the Germans, hoping that international alliances might help stabilize his reign. However, his foreign policy efforts were met with limited success. Ethiopia, despite being free from colonial rule, remained diplomatically isolated, with few reliable allies in the international arena. This left the young emperor vulnerable to the pressures of both external and internal forces. Historians continue to debate whether Iyasu's attempts to forge alliances with European powers were a sign of his desperation or a well-calculated strategy to modernize Ethiopia through foreign support. As the years passed, Iyasu's reign became increasingly unstable. The power of the regional lords continued to grow, and in 1916, just 3 years after Menelik's death, Iyasu was deposed in a coup orchestrated by a coalition of rival factions, including Empress Teitu, who had regained a measure of power. His deposition marked the beginning of a new era in Ethiopia, one characterized by internal strife and the continuing struggle between the monarchy and regional leaders. Although Iyasu had been anointed emperor, his reign had failed to unify the country, and his removal from power only deepened the divisions that Menelik had worked so hard to maintain. Following Iyasu's removal, Empress Teitu briefly attempted to influence the course of Ethiopian politics. She played a pivotal role in the selection of the next emperor, the young Haile Selassie I, who would eventually become one of the most famous and long-reigning monarchs in Ethiopian history. But Teitu's influence was short-lived. She was soon sidelined by those who favored Haile Selassie as a more stable and unifying figure. The tension between Teitu and the emerging new leadership reflected the larger struggle within Ethiopia for control of the throne and the country's future. Haile Selassie's rise to power would, in many ways, mark the beginning of a new chapter in Ethiopian history, though Menelik's efforts to modernize the country had been a mixed success. Haile Selassie's reign would usher in a new phase of political, social, and economic transformation. However, the road to Haile Selassie's ascension was paved with turmoil. His eventual reign, though marked by progress and reform, would face significant opposition from those who sought to maintain the old power structures that had defined Ethiopia under Menelik. The question of succession, which had plagued Menelik's later years, continued to haunt the empire long after his death. The political instability following Menelik's passing revealed the deep divisions within Ethiopian society, divisions that would only grow more pronounced in the years to come. Menelik's legacy, while strong in terms of Ethiopia's independence, was also marked by the inability to secure lasting political unity. His failure to establish a stable system of governance meant that Ethiopia's political future remained uncertain, even after his passing. Yet, Menelik I's legacy should not be defined solely by the internal strife that followed his death. His reign, particularly the victory at Adwa, cemented Ethiopia's place in history as one of the few African nations to successfully resist European colonization. The Battle of Adwa remains a powerful symbol of resistance, a reminder of Ethiopia's independence, and Menelik's role in securing it. His modernization efforts, while imperfect, laid the groundwork for the changes that would come in the 20th century. His reign, though ultimately marked by the challenges of maintaining power, was foundational to Ethiopia's independence and its place in African history. In hindsight, Menelik's reign can be seen as a period of both achievement and struggle. His success in keeping Ethiopia free from colonial rule was unparalleled in Africa. But his failure to create a lasting, unified political structure left Ethiopia vulnerable to internal conflict. The transition from Menelik to Iyasu and, eventually, Haile Selassie was a turbulent one. But it was also a necessary evolution in Ethiopia's political history. Menelik's vision for a modern Ethiopia, though not fully realized, continued to shape the country long after his death. In the wake of Menelik I's death, Ethiopia's political landscape remained as volatile as ever. The short reign of Emperor Iyasu V, though punctuated by his attempts to modernize, ended abruptly in 1916 with his deposition. His ousting marked a pivotal moment for the country, setting the stage for a new era under the young Haile Selassie I. But while Haile Selassie would ultimately go on to become one of Ethiopia's most renowned rulers, his ascension was anything but smooth. The period following Menelik's death was rife with political instability, and the dust from the coup that ousted Iyasu would not settle easily. The vacuum left by Menelik's absence was not just political, it was cultural, social, and economic. While Menelik had succeeded in preserving Ethiopia's independence from colonial powers, his internal policies, such as the attempts to modernize the state, had not been fully implemented. The regions, long accustomed to their autonomy, were still resistant to the centralized reforms Menelik had envisioned. Thus, the question that loomed large after his death was whether Ethiopia could find a ruler capable of uniting the country once again, or whether the disparate regions would drift further apart. Haile Selassie's rise was largely facilitated by the same factions that had been involved in deposing Iyasu. These factions, including military leaders, clergy, and regional aristocracy, were driven by the desire to stabilize Ethiopia under a strong ruler. Haile Selassie, though only a child at the time of Menelik's death, was viewed as the figurehead who could restore order and continuity to the Ethiopian monarchy. His youth was seen as an asset by some, since he was seen as someone who could be shaped by the political elites around him. But while Haile Selassie would eventually consolidate his power, his early reign was characterized by the same factional struggles that had plagued Ethiopia since Menelik's time. One of the major hurdles Haile Selassie faced early in his rule was the issue of legitimacy. He was not the direct son of Menelik, which left some questioning his claim to the throne. This was especially problematic when viewed through the lens of Ethiopia's feudal system, where dynastic succession was of utmost importance. The power vacuum left by Menelik's death meant that there were multiple contenders for the throne, and Haile Selassie's ascent to power was not guaranteed. This is where the influence of his allies, particularly those within the military, came into play. Haile Selassie's supporters knew that his leadership would not only offer political stability but also ensure the survival of the monarchy, even if it meant consolidating power by any means necessary. Yet, for all of Haile Selassie's early struggles with legitimacy and internal dissent, he would go on to prove himself a shrewd and capable ruler. One of his first major actions as emperor was to create a more centralized system of government. This move was seen as a direct continuation of Menelik's vision of a modern Ethiopia, though Haile Selassie would take it further, moving toward a more bureaucratic and modernized state. His establishment of a more centralized administration, however, was met with resistance from the regional lords, who had become accustomed to their own power. For them, Haile Selassie's centralization efforts were a direct challenge to their autonomy. While Menelik's land reforms had failed to fully resolve the issue of land distribution, Haile Selassie inherited this problem and attempted to address it. The emperor sought to create a more equitable system of land distribution, one that would give more power to the central government and reduce the influence of local lords. However, as with Menelik's reforms, this effort was met with strong resistance from the same regional lords who had dominated Ethiopia's feudal system for centuries. Land, in Ethiopia's society, was not just a resource, it was a symbol of power and status. Any attempt to redistribute land threatened the very foundation of Ethiopian aristocracy. Haile Selassie's attempts at land reform were not entirely unsuccessful, but they did not go as far as he had hoped. His reforms were largely limited to the Central Highlands, where the government had the most control. In the more remote regions of Ethiopia, the old feudal system continued to reign supreme. This was especially true in the southern and western parts of the country, where local chiefs and warlords still held sway over their territories. In these areas, Haile Selassie's government struggled to assert its authority. Historians often point to Haile Selassie's rule as a pivotal moment in Ethiopia's transition from a feudal society to a more modern state. But this transition was not an easy one. The emperor's efforts to centralize power were met with both external and internal resistance, and his political maneuvers often found themselves at odds with Ethiopia's deeply entrenched power structures. The question of how much Haile Selassie truly modernized Ethiopia remains a subject of debate. Some argue that his reign was one of significant progress, while others suggest that his reforms were limited and ultimately left Ethiopia's social and political systems largely unchanged. At the same time, Haile Selassie faced external pressures as well. While Menelik had successfully resisted European colonization, Haile Selassie's reign would be marked by a different kind of external threat: the rise of fascism in Italy. Mussolini's ambitions to expand the Italian Empire in Africa meant that Ethiopia's independence was once again under threat. Haile Selassie's reign would be tested in ways Menelik's had not been. The Battle of Adwa, while a definitive victory in the fight against European colonization, could not shield Ethiopia forever from the forces of imperialism. The shadow of Mussolini and the looming threat of Italian aggression would hang over Haile Selassie's early reign. Historians still debate Haile Selassie's role in this new international context. Did he manage to keep Ethiopia independent, as Menelik had done before him? Or did his reign mark a new chapter in Ethiopia's subjugation to foreign powers? Haile Selassie's decisions during this period would come to define his legacy, not only as a ruler who modernized Ethiopia, but also as one who fought to preserve its sovereignty in the face of external threats. The first few decades of Haile Selassie's reign were a mixed bag of progress and turmoil. His attempts at modernizing the state were commendable, but the deeply ingrained power structures within Ethiopia's society made true change difficult. His efforts to centralize power were constantly thwarted by regional lords and nobles. And his land reforms, while well-intentioned, fell short of bringing about true equality. Despite these challenges, Haile Selassie's leadership marked a significant shift in Ethiopia's history. His reign laid the groundwork for the country's eventual move toward modernization, even if the road ahead would remain fraught with obstacles. As Haile Selassie's reign progressed into the 1920s, Ethiopia found itself teetering on the brink of major change. The political instability that had followed Menelik II's death continued to simmer beneath the surface. But it was the looming external threats that would soon dominate the political landscape. By the time the 1930s arrived, Haile Selassie's ability to navigate both internal strife and the rising specter of Italian expansionism would be put to the ultimate test. The rise of fascist Italy under Benito Mussolini marked a new chapter in the history of Ethiopian sovereignty. Mussolini, with his imperial ambitions in Africa, sought to expand the Italian colonial empire by conquering Ethiopia, the last major independent African kingdom. For Haile Selassie, this posed not only a challenge to Ethiopia's independence but also a direct threat to the legacy of Menelik II, who had successfully repelled the Italians at the Battle of Adwa in 1896. It was a time of growing fear that Ethiopia could once again fall prey to foreign imperialism, despite the valiant efforts of its past rulers. Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia in 1935 would set the stage for one of the most defining moments of Haile Selassie's reign. In the face of Italian aggression, Haile Selassie would find himself not only defending his country's independence, but also positioning himself as a symbol of resistance for all of Africa. As the Italian forces advanced, using modern weaponry and chemical warfare, Ethiopia's forces, despite their bravery, were ill-equipped to withstand the Italian onslaught. Historians still debate how well Haile Selassie responded to the invasion. On one hand, his diplomatic efforts were notable. He appealed to the League of Nations, urging the international community to intervene on behalf of Ethiopia. His famous speech before the League in 1936 remains a cornerstone of his legacy. Standing in front of the assembly, Haile Selassie delivered a passionate plea for Ethiopia's sovereignty, warning that if Ethiopia were to fall, the world would face the consequences of unchecked imperialism. He famously declared, "It is us today, it will be you tomorrow." His speech garnered worldwide attention and sympathy, but it did little to stop the Italian invasion. The League's response was weak, offering only symbolic gestures, and the international community failed to come to Ethiopia's aid in any meaningful way. At the same time, Haile Selassie's military response to the invasion was hampered by a lack of modern equipment and resources. Despite his efforts to modernize Ethiopia's military in the years leading up to the invasion, the country was still largely dependent on outdated weaponry. The Italian forces, by contrast, were armed with the latest in military technology, including tanks, aircraft, and chemical weapons. The use of poison gas in particular marked a horrific chapter in the war, with Italian forces deploying chemical weapons against Ethiopian civilians and soldiers alike. The international community, already dealing with the rise of fascism in Europe, failed to intervene effectively, leaving Ethiopia to fend for itself. The failure of the League of Nations to act against Italian aggression was a crushing blow to Haile Selassie's efforts to secure Ethiopia's sovereignty. But rather than bowing to the overwhelming Italian forces, Haile Selassie's resolve remained strong. As the capital, Addis Ababa, fell to the Italians in May 1936, Haile Selassie fled the country, going into exile in Britain. His departure, though heartbreaking, was part of a larger strategy to rally international support and eventually return to Ethiopia with the help of foreign allies. Haile Selassie's exile was marked by a period of both personal and national anguish. For the Ethiopian people, the fall of their country to Italian forces was a devastating blow, and the loss of their emperor symbolized the end of an era. But Haile Selassie's exile would also sow the seeds for his eventual return to power. During his time in exile, Haile Selassie was able to garner sympathy for Ethiopia's cause, and his presence on the international stage as a champion of African independence would only grow in stature. In 1941, after 5 years of Italian occupation, Ethiopia was liberated by Allied forces during World War II. Haile Selassie returned to Ethiopia and reclaimed his throne, a moment that solidified his status as both a leader and a symbol of African resistance to imperialism. But while his return marked a moment of triumph, it also highlighted the ongoing challenges he faced in maintaining unity within Ethiopia. The country, still deeply divided by regional and ethnic tensions, was far from stable. Historians often point to Haile Selassie's return as a moment of victory. But it was also a moment of reckoning. While his leadership was celebrated internationally, his internal reforms had not fully addressed the deep-rooted issues of inequality, land distribution, and political fragmentation that had plagued Ethiopia since Menelik II's reign. The centralization of power in Haile Selassie's hands, though necessary in the face of external threats, had failed to resolve the structural issues within Ethiopian society, as he sought to modernize Ethiopia and steer it into the post-colonial world. Haile Selassie would find that the very divisions he had inherited from Menelik's reign were still alive and well. Moreover, the harsh realities of the Italian occupation left scars on the Ethiopian people. The use of chemical weapons, the mass killings, and the systematic destruction of villages under Italian rule had a lasting impact on Ethiopia's psyche. Haile Selassie's efforts to rebuild the nation were met with mixed results, and the challenges of governance remained formidable. Despite these obstacles, Haile Selassie's victory over Italy and his subsequent return to the throne were significant milestones in the history of African independence. He became a revered figure not just in Ethiopia but across the African continent. His role as a leader of resistance against colonialism made him a symbol of African pride, and his efforts to maintain Ethiopia's sovereignty resonated deeply in the post-colonial era. Yet, as with Menelik II before him, Haile Selassie's reign was marked by a legacy of both success and struggle. While he successfully kept Ethiopia independent during the early years of his reign, he also inherited and perpetuated the challenges that had long plagued the country. His attempts to modernize Ethiopia were ambitious, but they were not without their limitations. Historians continue to debate how much Haile Selassie truly succeeded in transforming Ethiopia into a modern state. What is clear, however, is that his leadership was instrumental in shaping the course of Ethiopian history and in preserving the country's independence during one of the most tumultuous periods in global history. Haile Selassie's return to the throne in 1941, after the expulsion of the Italian forces, marked the beginning of a new era for Ethiopia, but it also brought with it a series of fresh challenges. The emperor's return was celebrated by many, not just within Ethiopia but across Africa. His defiance against Italian colonization had made him a symbol of resistance, and his efforts to reclaim Ethiopia's sovereignty from the fascist invaders had won him international admiration. Yet, as Ethiopia's ruler, Haile Selassie faced internal turmoil that threatened to undo the very progress he had worked so hard to achieve. Upon his return, Haile Selassie was determined to modernize Ethiopia, and his focus shifted to implementing reforms that would address the country's deeply entrenched issues. However, his efforts were hindered by the same forces that had destabilized Ethiopia throughout Menelik II's reign: regionalism, ethnic divisions, and the power of the aristocracy. The feudal system that Menelik had inherited from earlier rulers was still very much alive. And despite Haile Selassie's modernizing rhetoric, much of the old guard remained in power. The emperor had hoped to push forward with reforms that would centralize authority and create a more unified state. But his ability to implement these reforms was limited by the powerful regional lords and the deeply ingrained social hierarchies of Ethiopian society. One of Haile Selassie's first major initiatives was to create a modern bureaucracy, which he believed would help bring order to Ethiopia's fragmented political landscape. However, implementing such a system was easier said than done. The entrenched power of the regional aristocracy and the church made it difficult for the emperor to gain full control over the state apparatus. His attempts at creating a centralized government were met with resistance, particularly from the military and the local nobility, who were reluctant to relinquish their power. In many regions, the emperor's policies were viewed as an infringement on traditional customs and the established social order, further exacerbating Ethiopia's political divide. In addition to the internal divisions, Haile Selassie's reign also saw the rise of new social and political movements that called for greater change. One of the most significant of these was the rise of student activism, which began to challenge the status quo and demand reforms that would address the issues of inequality and corruption in Ethiopia. The students, inspired by global movements for social change and progress, were vocal in their opposition to the emperor's government, calling for greater democratic reforms and a more equitable distribution of resources. Historians still debate the extent to which Haile Selassie was able to truly modernize Ethiopia. While his initiatives to centralize the government and implement legal reforms were notable, many argue that his efforts were insufficient to address the deep-rooted issues that plagued the country. Despite his ambitions to modernize Ethiopia, the emperor struggled to overcome the legacy of Ethiopia's feudal past, and his inability to fully unify the country would eventually contribute to his downfall. The 1960s and early 1970s saw growing unrest among the Ethiopian populace. The economic situation in the country, while somewhat improved by Haile Selassie's early efforts to modernize, remained precarious. Many Ethiopians, particularly those in rural areas, continued to live in poverty, and the emperor's failure to implement land reforms left a large portion of the population disenfranchised. The ongoing problems of land distribution, combined with the growing dissatisfaction among the educated urban population, created a volatile situation. In many ways, the deep social divisions that had marked Menelik II's reign were still present, and Haile Selassie's attempts to address them had been only partially successful. Perhaps the most telling sign of the emperor's inability to fully address Ethiopia's problems was the failure of the 1974 reform movement. Initially, Haile Selassie had appeared to be open to making significant changes. In the early 1970s, he began to take steps toward creating a more participatory government, seeking to involve more Ethiopians in the decision-making process. However, his attempts at reform were seen by many as too little, too late. By the mid-1970s, the Ethiopian people had grown increasingly disillusioned with their ruler, and the failure of his reforms to create lasting change led to widespread protests and strikes. This growing dissatisfaction culminated in the 1974 Ethiopian Revolution, which resulted in the emperor's overthrow. Haile Selassie's reign came to an end when a military coup, led by the Derg, a Marxist-Leninist military junta, overthrew him in September 1974. The emperor, who had once been the face of Ethiopia's sovereignty and resistance against foreign domination, was now a prisoner in his own palace. His fall from power was both swift and dramatic, and it marked the end of the Ethiopian monarchy that had ruled for centuries. After his deposition, Haile Selassie was placed under house arrest and eventually died under mysterious circumstances in 1975. A tragic end to the reign of one of Ethiopia's most iconic rulers. Historians continue to analyze Haile Selassie's legacy, with opinions often divided. On one hand, he is remembered as the last emperor of Ethiopia, a ruler who tried to modernize his country in the face of tremendous internal and external challenges. He was also a prominent figure on the world stage, advocating for African unity and independence and playing a key role in the establishment of the Organization of African Unity, OAU. His legacy as a champion of African independence, especially in the context of his appeal to the League of Nations during the Italian invasion, has earned him a place of honor in African history. On the other hand, Haile Selassie's reign is also marked by the failure to address the structural issues that had plagued Ethiopia for centuries. His inability to fully unite the country, combined with his struggles to reform Ethiopia's feudal system, ultimately led to his downfall. His monarchy, despite its grand history and the early achievements of his rule, could not survive the pressures of modernization and internal discontent. His failure to effectively tackle the problem of poverty and inequality, and his reliance on a centralized, authoritarian system, left many Ethiopians disillusioned by the time of his overthrow. Haile Selassie's reign, much like that of Menelik II, was a tale of ambition and struggle. While his leadership helped preserve Ethiopia's independence during some of its most challenging times, it also highlighted the difficulties of governing a nation that had long been divided by regionalism and social inequality. The emperor's attempts to modernize the country were notable, but they ultimately failed to address the root causes of Ethiopia's problems. In the end, Haile Selassie's legacy is a complex one, marked by both triumph and failure. The fall of Haile Selassie in 1974 signaled the end of Ethiopia's centuries-old monarchy, but it did not usher in the hoped-for age of political stability. The military coup, led by the Derg, created a vacuum that would soon be filled by Marxist revolutionary ideologies, setting Ethiopia on a course of radical transformation. For many, Haile Selassie's deposition marked the collapse of a golden era, Yet the country's subsequent descent into turmoil would reveal how deeply the structural issues of poverty, land inequality, and political fragmentation ran in the fabric of Ethiopian society. The Derg, a military junta that took power after the emperor's overthrow, quickly moved to establish a new government founded on Marxist-Leninist principles. At the time, these revolutionary ideals were gaining traction across the globe, spurred by the successes of the Soviet Union and the rise of nationalist movements in Africa and Asia. The Derg sought to dismantle the old feudal system that had existed under Menelik II, Haile Selassie, and the centuries of Ethiopian emperors before them. But like Haile Selassie's attempts at modernization, the Derg's approach would prove deeply flawed, exacerbating the very problems it intended to solve. In the early days of the Derg's rule, there was a sense of optimism among many Ethiopians, particularly in the urban centers. The promise of land reforms, nationalization of key industries, and the establishment of a more egalitarian society resonated with the masses. However, these promises were soon betrayed as the Derg's leadership turned increasingly authoritarian. Led by Mengistu Haile Mariam, who would emerge as the most powerful figure within the junta, Mengistu's rise was marked by brutal purges, political repression, and a violent crackdown on dissent. His reign would become synonymous with the Red Terror, a period of state-sanctioned violence aimed at eliminating perceived enemies of the revolution. The Derg's aggressive land reforms were initially heralded as a solution to the vast inequities that had characterized Ethiopian society. Under Menelik II and Haile Selassie, the vast majority of the population, particularly in rural areas, had been left with little access to land, with the aristocracy and military elite controlling much of it. The Derg sought to redistribute land from the old elite and grant it to the peasantry. However, the reforms were not carefully executed. The land was often redistributed inefficiently, and the lack of proper infrastructure and support systems meant that many peasants struggled to make a living off the land they were given. Far from improving the conditions of rural Ethiopians, the Derg's policies often left them in worse shape, particularly when coupled with the political repression that followed. Historians still debate the effectiveness of the Derg's policies, with some arguing that the land reform program had potential, had it been carried out properly, while others believe that the Derg's fundamental misunderstanding of Ethiopia's agricultural needs doomed the effort from the start. The problem of land distribution, though a central issue for both Menelik II and Haile Selassie, remained unresolved in the long term. The Derg's approach was simply too radical, too rushed, and lacked the kind of nuanced, patient policy making that might have addressed the deeper issues of rural poverty and land management. While the Derg's land reforms proved disastrous, its economic policies were equally troubling. Nationalizing industries, though ideologically appealing to Marxist leaders, failed to yield the desired outcomes. Ethiopia's economy, once dominated by agriculture, was unable to transition to industrialization without proper planning or infrastructure. The Derg, in its zeal to remake Ethiopian society along socialist lines, overlooked the practical realities of running a modern economy. Factories remained underfunded, agricultural output decreased, and a massive famine struck the country in the mid-1970s, exacerbating the already dire conditions in rural areas. The Derg's tenure also saw Ethiopia embroiled in a bloody civil war, which would last for years. The rebel movements, most notably the Tigray People's Liberation Front, TPLF, and the Eritrean separatists, waged an insurgency against the Derg's rule. This conflict was compounded by the intervention of foreign powers. The Soviet Union, Cuba, and other communist nations supported the Derg, while the United States, as part of its Cold War strategy, backed the opposition forces. The war, combined with famine and economic collapse, further isolated the Derg from the Ethiopian people, many of whom saw the government as an oppressive force rather than a liberating one. Historians often point to the civil war and the regime's violent repression of dissent as central to the Derg's downfall. The Red Terror, which had been initiated as a way to eliminate opposition to the regime, only served to alienate large portions of the population. By the early 1990s, the Derg was losing ground, and the country was sliding deeper into chaos. In 1991, after nearly 2 decades of war and suffering, the Derg was overthrown, and Mengistu fled to exile in Zimbabwe. The fall of the Derg marked the end of one chapter of Ethiopian history. But it did not usher in an era of peace. The country remained fractured by the ongoing war in the north, and Ethiopia's social and political problems continued to simmer beneath the surface. The legacy of the Derg's rule, much like that of Menelik II and Haile Selassie, was one of ambition and failure. The grand promises of revolution, land reform, and economic prosperity ultimately fell short, leaving a nation broken by years of internal conflict and mismanagement. The events that unfolded in Ethiopia after Haile Selassie's fall highlight how the country's challenges were not solely the result of imperialism or monarchy. The issues of inequality, land distribution, and political fragmentation were deeply ingrained in the country's social fabric and could not be solved by radical shifts in power or ideological revolutions. As Ethiopia entered the 21st century, its leaders would face the same questions that had plagued Menelik, Haile Selassie, and the Derg: how to unite a country divided by regionalism, class, and ethnicity, how to address the vast inequalities in society, and perhaps most importantly, how to build a government that could balance the need for central authority with the diverse needs of Ethiopia's various peoples. Historians still reflect on Ethiopia's long struggle for unity and modernization. Despite the failure of both the monarchy and the Derg, some argue that the experience of these regimes offers important lessons for understanding the complexities of governance in a country as diverse and politically fractured as Ethiopia. Others point to the enduring legacy of Haile Selassie, whose status as a symbol of African resistance continues to inspire movements for unity and independence across the continent. In the end, the history of Ethiopia in the 20th century is a story of rulers, revolutions, and the unyielding desire for progress. The figures of Menelik II, Haile Selassie, and the Derg, though separated by time and ideology, were all shaped by the same central question: how to modernize a deeply traditional society and create a nation that could stand on the world stage. Their failures, and their successes, continue to resonate in Ethiopia's journey toward a more stable and unified future. As Ethiopia moved into the 1990s, the echoes of its tumultuous past, marked by centuries of monarchy, military rule, and revolution, were still deeply ingrained in the fabric of the country. The fall of the Derg in 1991 did not immediately herald an era of peace or stability, as many had hoped. Instead, the country found itself in a delicate moment of transition, struggling with the legacies of its fractured political landscape, ethnic divisions, and a faltering economy. After the Derg's fall, Ethiopia found itself under the rule of a new political system, the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, EPRDF, which was led by the Tigray People's Liberation Front, TPLF. This new coalition was formed in the wake of the civil war, and its primary goal was to bring an end to the violent conflicts that had plagued the country for decades. However, the path to peace would be a difficult one, as the TPLF's dominance within the EPRDF was viewed with suspicion by many in Ethiopia, particularly from regions that had been excluded or marginalized by the new government. One of the central challenges facing the new government was how to reconcile the country's deeply entrenched ethnic divisions. Ethiopia has long been a mosaic of ethnic groups, each with its own distinct culture, language, and history. The country's political system, under the monarchy and later the Derg, had largely ignored these ethnic differences, opting instead for a centralized system that often marginalized or even oppressed smaller groups. with the new government. However, the EPRDF attempted to address these divisions by adopting a federal system that allowed regional governments to govern according to their own ethnic identities. This move was hailed by some as a necessary step toward promoting ethnic autonomy. But it also sowed the seeds of future instability. The federal system, while intended to give greater power to ethnic groups, often led to greater competition and tension between regions. Rivalries between the various ethnic factions, each vying for control and resources, were exacerbated by the new system. The federalization of Ethiopia, though well-intentioned, created a political environment ripe for division and conflict. And in many ways, the system became a double-edged sword, promoting ethnic self-determination, but also deepening the fractures within the country. The introduction of ethnic federalism was one of the most significant legacies of the post-Derg era, and its impact continues to be felt in Ethiopia today. In theory, the system allowed ethnic groups to preserve their cultural identities and have a say in the running of their own affairs. In practice, however, it has often resulted in heightened tensions and disputes over territory and resources. One of the most notable examples of this is the ongoing conflict in the Tigray region, which erupted into full-scale war in 2020, following a breakdown in relations between the TPLF and the central government. This conflict, which has resulted in thousands of deaths and widespread displacement, is just one example of the difficulties that come with managing a diverse country like Ethiopia under a system of ethnic federalism. Historians are still divided over whether ethnic federalism was the right path for Ethiopia. Some argue that it was a necessary step in addressing the country's deep-rooted ethnic divisions, while others believe that it has only deepened these divisions, making it more difficult to build a cohesive national identity. The debate remains unresolved, and the consequences of ethnic federalism continue to unfold in the ongoing conflicts within the country. Despite the challenges of ethnic federalism, the EPRDF government did manage to bring a degree of stability to Ethiopia in the early years of its rule. The country experienced economic growth, albeit unevenly distributed, and efforts were made to rebuild the infrastructure that had been neglected under the Derg. Education and healthcare were prioritized, and the government made significant strides in expanding access to basic services, especially in rural areas. However, these gains were overshadowed by the growing authoritarianism of the EPRDF and the increasing centralization of power within the ruling coalition. Under the leadership of Meles Zenawi, who became Ethiopia's prime minister in 1995, the government took a hard line against political dissent. While Meles was credited with helping to transform Ethiopia's economy and improve its international standing, his government became increasingly repressive. Opposition parties were sidelined, civil society was stifled, and freedom of speech was curtailed. The 2005 elections, in which the opposition made significant gains, were marred by allegations of fraud and violence, and the government responded with a brutal crackdown on dissent. Human rights abuses became widespread, and Ethiopia's reputation as a democratic nation took a serious hit. The EPRDF's grip on power was also supported by its ability to manage Ethiopia's foreign relations. Meles Zenawi, who had been an important figure in the overthrow of the Derg, maintained close ties with Western countries, particularly the United States, which viewed Ethiopia as a key partner in the fight against terrorism in the Horn of Africa. This alliance brought Ethiopia much-needed foreign aid and military support, but it also led to accusations of authoritarianism and human rights violations being ignored in exchange for geopolitical cooperation. Despite these challenges, Ethiopia's overall trajectory during this period was one of continued economic growth. At least on paper, the country's GDP grew significantly, and infrastructure projects, including roads, bridges, and energy plants, were launched. However, this growth often failed to reach the poorest Ethiopians, and the country's deep inequalities persisted. The growing wealth gap and political repression created a sense of disillusionment among many Ethiopians, particularly the youth, who felt excluded from the country's development. Historians still argue about the long-term impact of Meles Zenawi's government. On one hand, his leadership brought stability and economic growth to Ethiopia after decades of war and poverty. On the other hand, his government's authoritarian tendencies and disregard for political freedoms have left a complex legacy. The country's current political environment, marked by protests, unrest, and calls for reform, is a direct consequence of the authoritarian practices that were entrenched under the EPRDF. Ultimately, the question remains, could Ethiopia have avoided the conflicts that arose in the post-Derg period? Some believe that the country's diverse ethnic makeup was always going to pose challenges for any government, no matter how well-intentioned. Others argue that a more inclusive, democratic system might have prevented the deep divisions and violent conflicts that continue to plague Ethiopia today. Whatever the case, the legacy of Ethiopia's post-monarchy era is one of both progress and setbacks. A complicated history shaped by the country's long-standing quest for unity, stability, and identity. As Ethiopia entered the 2010s, the complexity of its political landscape only deepened. Marked by both visible economic progress and growing social unrest, the government's focus on large-scale infrastructure projects and industrialization made it a darling of international financial institutions. But it also exacerbated tensions within the population, particularly with Ethiopia's youth and marginalized ethnic groups. The political discontent that had been brewing under the surface for years came to a head in 2015, when protests broke out across the country, particularly in the Oromo and Amhara regions, challenging the ruling party's grip on power and questioning the legitimacy of the federal system itself. The protests were sparked by a wide array of grievances: economic inequality, land grabbing, unemployment, political repression, and the centralization of power under the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, EPRDF. Ethiopia's rapid urbanization and industrialization had resulted in the displacement of thousands of rural farmers, particularly in Oromia, where land was being seized for development projects. The government's approach to land development, which often involved leasing large tracts of land to foreign corporations, was seen by many as an infringement on the rights of local communities. This sense of dispossession, combined with a lack of political representation, led to widespread disillusionment and ultimately to mass protests in 2015. The protests, however, were not solely about land and economic inequality. They reflected deeper frustrations with the political system that had, for decades, been dominated by the Tigray-led EPRDF. The centralization of power in the hands of the Tigray minority, which had been the core of the ruling coalition since the 1990s, alienated other ethnic groups, particularly the Oromo, who constitute the largest ethnic group in Ethiopia. Despite their size, the Oromo had long been politically marginalized, and their demands for greater autonomy and political representation were largely ignored. The Amhara, the second largest ethnic group in Ethiopia, also joined the protests, demanding political reforms and greater recognition. The government's response to the protests was swift and brutal. Security forces used excessive force to suppress dissent, resulting in hundreds, possibly thousands, of deaths. The authorities imposed curfews, shut down the internet, and arrested opposition leaders, accusing them of fomenting unrest. Yet, despite the government's efforts to quell the protests, the discontent continued to grow. The protests were not just a reaction to the immediate grievances of land and unemployment, they were a manifestation of a broader frustration with Ethiopia's political system, which many felt was rigged against them. Historians continue to debate the root causes of the 2015-2016 protests and whether they represented a genuine shift in Ethiopian politics or simply a temporary outbreak of unrest. Some argue that the protests mark the beginning of a long overdue reckoning with the ethnic federalism system and the dominance of the Tigray-led government. Others see them as part of a larger global wave of populist uprisings, driven by youth disillusionment with entrenched political elites. One thing is certain: the protests were a wake-up call for the Ethiopian government, signaling that its authoritarian rule was no longer sustainable. In response to the protests, the EPRDF made several significant concessions. In 2018, the government, under the leadership of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, began a series of sweeping reforms that sought to address some of the underlying issues driving the unrest. Abiy, who had come to power after the resignation of his predecessor, Hailemariam Desalegn, promised to open up the political space, release political prisoners, and lift the state of emergency that had been imposed during the protests. His reforms were initially met with widespread enthusiasm, both domestically and internationally, as many believed that he could lead Ethiopia into a new era of peace and democracy. Abiy's government made bold moves, such as signing a peace agreement with Eritrea in 2018, officially ending a decades-long war between the two nations. This historic peace deal earned Abiy the Nobel Peace Prize in 2019 and made him a global symbol of diplomacy and hope. However, Abiy's rise to power was also fraught with challenges. His attempts to implement sweeping political and economic reforms ran into fierce resistance from entrenched political forces, particularly within the EPRDF, where factions loyal to the old regime still held significant influence. Additionally, the unresolved ethnic tensions that had plagued Ethiopia for decades remained a pressing issue. And despite Abiy's attempts to bring the country together, the divisions only deepened. Historians are still divided on whether Abiy's reforms represented a genuine opportunity for Ethiopia to break free from its troubled past or whether they were simply a temporary reprieve before the country slid back into conflict. Some view him as a visionary leader who sought to dismantle the authoritarian structures that had held Ethiopia back for decades, while others argue that his reforms were too rapid and inadequately planned, leading to unintended consequences. The challenge of balancing Ethiopia's complex ethnic dynamics with political stability was never going to be easy, and Abiy's ambitious vision quickly ran up against the reality of deep-rooted divisions in Ethiopian society. One of the most dramatic signs of the challenges Abiy faced came in 2020, when the Tigray People's Liberation Front, TPLF, the former ruling party of the Tigray region, broke with the central government, escalating into a brutal conflict that would become one of the deadliest and most complex in the Horn of Africa. The Tigray War, as it came to be known, was a devastating reminder of how quickly Ethiopia's fragile peace could unravel. The war involved not only the TPLF and the Ethiopian military, but also neighboring Eritrean forces, making it a regional conflict with far-reaching consequences. As of the early 2020s, the war in Tigray was still ongoing, and its aftermath would shape the country's future for years to come. Historians are still grappling with how to characterize the political crisis that Ethiopia found itself in by the early 2020s. Was it a failed attempt at reform, a tragic backslide into authoritarianism, or simply the culmination of decades of unresolved ethnic tension? The story of Ethiopia's modern history, with its endless struggles between progress and conflict, continues to be written. Some believe that the next chapter of Ethiopia's political evolution will be one of reconciliation, while others fear that the country may be heading toward even greater division and instability. The country's future remains uncertain, but one thing is clear: Ethiopia's struggle for unity and democracy is far from over. Whether it can overcome the deep-rooted challenges that have plagued it for centuries, or whether it will continue to spiral into conflict and fragmentation, remains a question that only time will answer. The conflict in Tigray, which erupted in late 2020, is perhaps the most glaring reminder of the fragile state of Ethiopia's political and social cohesion. What started as a political standoff between the Tigray People's Liberation Front, TPLF, and the central government of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed quickly escalated into a full-scale war that displaced millions, resulted in thousands of deaths, and left the Horn of Africa grappling with one of the worst humanitarian crises of the 21st century. The roots of the Tigray conflict go deep, tracing back to the historical complexities of Ethiopia's federal system and the ethnic-based politics that the EPRDF had put in place in the 1990s. Under the leadership of Meles Zenawi, Tigrayans had played a dominant role in the ruling coalition, but as Abiy Ahmed, a member of the Oromo ethnic group, rose to power in 2018, he pushed for a series of reforms that undermined the TPLF's power. In particular, Abiy dismantled the EPRDF and replaced it with a more centralized ruling structure, in an effort to reduce ethnic-based political control. The TPLF, which had long been accustomed to exercising significant influence over the political landscape, saw these moves as an existential threat to its position. They refused to accept Abiy's reforms, arguing that his government was undermining the ethnic federalism system that had been established after the Derg's fall. The TPLF's defiance, combined with the central government's increasingly authoritarian tendencies, created a perfect storm of tensions that ultimately erupted into violence. Historians still debate whether the Tigray conflict could have been avoided. Some argue that the tensions between Abiy and the TPLF were inevitable, given the deep historical divisions within Ethiopia's political system. Others believe that Abiy's attempts to reform the political system, while necessary, were too abrupt and poorly timed, alienating the TPLF and triggering a violent backlash. One thing that is clear, however, is that the conflict has exacerbated the country's already fragile ethnic relations, with dire consequences for Ethiopia's stability. The war has led to widespread atrocities. Both sides have been accused of committing grave human rights violations, including extrajudicial killings, sexual violence, and the targeting of civilians. The Ethiopian government, along with its allies in Eritrea, has faced allegations of war crimes, while the TPLF has also been accused of atrocities, including the massacre of civilians in areas under its control. The humanitarian toll has been staggering, with millions of people displaced by the conflict, facing severe food shortages and lack of access to basic services. The international response to the Tigray war has been a mix of condemnation, calls for ceasefire, and attempts to mediate peace talks. However, diplomatic efforts have largely been unsuccessful, and the war continues to rage. The conflict has drawn in neighboring Eritrean forces, who had once been enemies with Ethiopia, but found common cause with Abiy's government against the TPLF. The involvement of Eritrean troops has added a regional dimension to the conflict, complicating efforts for peace and raising concerns about the broader stability of the Horn of Africa. In Ethiopia, the war has led to increasing polarization. The Tigray region, where the conflict originated, has been devastated by the fighting. While the TPLF initially made gains, the central government has since regained control over much of the region. However, Tigray remains deeply embroiled in the conflict, and its people have borne the brunt of the humanitarian disaster. The emotional and psychological toll of the war on Ethiopians is hard to quantify, as families are torn apart, communities shattered, and an entire generation's prospects jeopardized. While the Tigray conflict rages on, it is essential to consider the broader implications for Ethiopia's future. The war has raised fundamental questions about Ethiopia's political system and its ability to manage ethnic divisions. Can a country so deeply divided along ethnic lines ever forge a unified national identity? Or is ethnic federalism, with all its faults, the only way forward? These questions are likely to shape the future of Ethiopia for years to come. Historians argue that Ethiopia's ethnic federalism, which was designed to empower diverse groups and prevent dominance by a single ethnic group, has instead created deep divisions and rivalries. This system, though well-intentioned, has contributed to the fragmentation of the country, with different ethnic groups competing for power and resources. The Tigray War, with its brutal toll on Ethiopia's social fabric, is just the latest chapter in a history of ethnic tensions that stretches back centuries. The question of whether ethnic federalism should be abandoned or reformed remains contentious. Some believe that Ethiopia needs a new political system that transcends ethnic lines and focuses on national unity. Others argue that ethnic federalism, if managed properly, can still provide a framework for peace and inclusivity. What is clear, however, is that Ethiopia's future cannot be settled without addressing the ethnic divisions that have long defined its political and social landscape. Despite the ongoing war and the many challenges Ethiopia faces, there are still glimmers of hope. Abiy's government, despite its flaws and the current crisis, has made significant strides in infrastructure development and poverty reduction. Ethiopia's economy, although faltering under the weight of the conflict, has shown resilience in certain areas, such as agriculture and manufacturing. The potential for Ethiopia to emerge from its current crisis stronger, more unified, and more democratic remains, but it will require difficult choices, bold leadership, and the willingness to embrace reconciliation and reform. The conflict in Tigray, while devastating, serves as a powerful reminder of the fragility of peace and the complex web of forces that shape Ethiopia's political landscape. Whether Ethiopia can navigate its way out of the current crisis or whether the divisions that have long simmered beneath the surface will continue to tear the country apart remains uncertain. One thing, however, is clear: Ethiopia's journey is far from over. The conflict in Tigray, which erupted in late 2020, is perhaps the most glaring reminder of the fragile state of Ethiopia's political and social cohesion. What started as a political standoff between the Tigray People's Liberation Front (TPLF) and the central government of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed quickly escalated into a full-scale war that displaced millions, resulted in thousands of deaths, and left the Horn of Africa grappling with one of the worst humanitarian crises of the 21st century. The roots of the Tigray conflict go deep, tracing back to the historical complexities of Ethiopia's federal system and the ethnic-based politics that the EPRDF had put in place in the 1990s. Under the leadership of Meles Zenawi, Tigrayans had played a dominant role in the ruling coalition. But as Abiy Ahmed, a member of the Oromo ethnic group, rose to power in 2018, he pushed for a series of reforms that undermined the TPLF's power. In particular, Abiy dismantled the EPRDF and replaced it with a more centralized ruling structure, in an effort to reduce ethnic-based political control. The TPLF, which had long been accustomed to exercising significant influence over the political landscape, saw these moves as an existential threat to its position. They refused to accept Abiy's reforms, arguing that his government was undermining the ethnic federalism system that had been established after the Derg's fall. The TPLF's defiance, combined with the central government's increasingly authoritarian tendencies, created a perfect storm of tensions that ultimately erupted into violence. Historians still debate whether the Tigray conflict could have been avoided. Some argue that the tensions between Abiy and the TPLF were inevitable, given the deep historical divisions within Ethiopia's political system. Others believe that Abiy's attempts to reform the political system, while necessary, were too abrupt and poorly timed, alienating the TPLF and triggering a violent backlash. One thing that is clear, however, is that the conflict has exacerbated the country's already fragile ethnic relations, with dire consequences for Ethiopia's stability. The war has led to widespread atrocities. Both sides have been accused of committing grave human rights violations, including extrajudicial killings, sexual violence, and the targeting of civilians. The Ethiopian government, along with its allies in Eritrea, has faced allegations of war crimes, while the TPLF has also been accused of atrocities. including the massacre of civilians in areas under its control. The humanitarian toll has been staggering, with millions of people displaced by the conflict, facing severe food shortages and lack of access to basic services. The international response to the Tigray war has been a mix of condemnation, calls for ceasefire, and attempts to mediate peace talks. However, diplomatic efforts have largely been unsuccessful, and the war continues to rage. The conflict has drawn in neighboring Eritrean forces, who had once been enemies with Ethiopia, but found common cause with Abiy's government against the TPLF. The involvement of Eritrean troops has added a regional dimension to the conflict, complicating efforts for peace and raising concerns about the broader stability of the Horn of Africa. In Ethiopia, the war has led to increasing polarization. The Tigray region, where the conflict originated, has been devastated by the fighting. While the TPLF initially made gains, the central government has since regained control over much of the region. However, Tigray remains deeply embroiled in the conflict, and its people have borne the brunt of the humanitarian disaster. The emotional and psychological toll of the war on Ethiopians is hard to quantify. As families are torn apart, communities shattered, and an entire generation's prospects jeopardized. While the Tigray conflict rages on, it is essential to consider the broader implications for Ethiopia's future. The war has raised fundamental questions about Ethiopia's political system and its ability to manage ethnic divisions. Can a country so deeply divided along ethnic lines ever forge a unified national identity? Or is ethnic federalism, with all its faults, the only way forward? These questions are likely to shape the future of Ethiopia for years to come. Historians argue that Ethiopia's ethnic federalism, which was designed to empower diverse groups and prevent dominance by a single ethnic group, has instead created deep divisions and rivalries. This system, though well-intentioned, has contributed to the fragmentation of the country, with different ethnic groups competing for power and resources. The Tigray War, with its brutal toll on Ethiopia's social fabric, is just the latest chapter in a history of ethnic tensions that stretches back centuries. The question of whether ethnic federalism should be abandoned or reformed remains contentious. Some believe that Ethiopia needs a new political system that transcends ethnic lines and focuses on national unity. Others argue that ethnic federalism, if managed properly, can still provide a framework for peace and inclusivity. What is clear, however, is that Ethiopia's future cannot be settled without addressing the ethnic divisions that have long defined its political and social landscape. Despite the ongoing war and the many challenges Ethiopia faces, there are still glimmers of hope. Abiy's government, despite its flaws and the current crisis, has made significant strides in infrastructure development and poverty reduction. Ethiopia's economy, although faltering under the weight of the conflict, has shown resilience in certain areas, such as agriculture and manufacturing. The potential for Ethiopia to emerge from its current crisis stronger, more unified, and more democratic remains, but it will require difficult choices, bold leadership, and the willingness to embrace reconciliation and reform. The conflict in Tigray, while devastating, serves as a powerful reminder of the fragility of peace and the complex web of forces that shape Ethiopia's political landscape. Whether Ethiopia can navigate its way out of the current crisis or whether the divisions that have long simmered beneath the surface will continue to tear the country apart remains uncertain. One thing, however, is clear: Ethiopia's journey is far from over.